In this video, I'll tell you about the most important miniature hobbyist skill of all that no one ever seems to talk about: how to be a problem solver. When you're first learning how to paint miniatures, you're mainly learning about brush control and painting techniques. Brushes are not as natural to us these days as, say, like pens or pencils might be. Maybe you got to paint pictures with a brush, and some of those tempera paints and stuff like that in art classes during grade school back when you were a kid. Then at least you have a little bit of experience with using a brush. But generally, brushes take a little getting used to at first. How much paint to use, how to best hold them, for miniature painting, how to clean them, all that kind of stuff. Once you get that figured out to some degree, then it's learning techniques like dry brushing, washes, glazing, edge highlighting, and more. But it's not all about how to use a brush and, paint techniques. Those are things you admittedly really need to learn in the early days of your miniature painting journey. And practicing by painting model after model will certainly help you out with that. But one of the most important things to help your miniatures painting get better is something that's very hard to learn directly. It's not a simple technique like how to dry brush or, how to keep your wrists together, when you paint or something like that, though both of those things are things that you should really certainly practice. Instead, it's the skill of problem solving that will really serve you best as you paint more miniatures. Models come in all shapes and sizes. They all have their special differences that make each one of them a unique challenge. So, unless you're going to be following a paint-along tutorial for a specific model and following each, step as instructed one after the other, you'll probably have to deploy at least a little bit of problem solving to get every other model done. And don't get me wrong, I watch tutorials all the time, but I do it to learn new ways to do things, not as a recipe that I have to strictly follow. So much of problem solving comes from experience. You discover different ways to solve certain miniature painting problems by mostly trial and error, or maybe getting advice from a more veteran miniature painter. As far as trial and error is concerned, it's best to really look at a model and try to figure out, where there might be problems ahead of time. Like how do I paint the white glow on the lightning claws with an airbrush without getting the spray all over the model and my mostly finished paint job? It would have been smarter for me to think ahead in this situation, but I didn't. So how I solved this problem on old Uncle Tickles here, who I basically painted to completion and then wanted to do the light blue to white gradient on the lightning claws there with an airbrush because I kinda suck at brush blending. The way I solved this issue was to just cover him in poster putty with just his lightning claws sticking out, and then I could airbrush the white over the tips to make it blend into the light blue, giving the classic light blue to white gradient for power weapons, right, that we've all seen, but yet didn't get any overspray on the rest of him and his armor and all that kind of stuff. Poster putty is a spectacular tool for your miniature painting problem-solving toolbox. So problem-solving experience comes from experience, right? But as with the example of Uncle Tickles a moment ago, you can learn problem-solving tricks from other places other than just trial and error. I didn't come up with the idea of covering him in poster putty all by myself. I had seen a photo somewhere on the internet of a person who wanted to do roughly the same thing on a model, but I think it was a power sword or something like that and not lightning claws, and they'd used poster putty to mask off the rest of the model. I just used that idea to solve my problem. The order in which you paint parts of the model can give you fewer or sometimes more problems. If you've ever painted a part, right, of a model and then painted another part next to it and then gotten paint all over the first part, the paint from the second part, you got all over the first part, and then had to go back and then paint the first part again with the original color, then you've hopefully learned a little bit more about problem solving. That said, There's kind of an easy rule that helps with that kind of issue and could fix your problems before you even need to solve them. Painting from the inside out. Now, it doesn't work in absolutely every situation, but it helps a lot. I made an Uncle Adam's pro tip video about this nearly 10 years ago. Pachow. But the gist of it is that it's better to paint the lowest areas on the model first and then paint each layer up of the model, clothes, armor, weapons, and stuff like that, all up from there. Usually it's best to paint the skin on the model first, right? And then the next layer of clothes, and then the next layer of clothes or armor or whatever above that, and to kind of go that way. It's because you'll almost absolutely get some skin color, right, on the edge of the clothes as you go to paint that area where they meet, right? Because it's raised, it's a raised area. But if you paint the clothes next, then you can cover up the skin color that you got on the clothes with the clothes color. It's basically about planning for mistakes. Now, again, this is not an absolute rule. If a model is, let's say, mostly wearing a purple cloak and only like their hands and feet and face are showing, right? Well, then you might want to do all of the purple first, especially if you're using an airbrush to lay down the purple and the shading and all of that. Then you can just do the skin parts afterwards, being very careful not to get the skin tone on the purple parts. But because they're so small or so much less skin space versus robe space in this situation, it just makes more sense. But if you're painting a model normally, right, like without doing the big giant purple overshade on all of the clothes or whatever, then it's usually best, again, to start with the lowest layer, whether it's skin or fur or bone or whatever. Speaking of airbrushing, I worked on 5 Robot Legion Warriors from One Page Rules at the end of last year, and I knew I wanted to do some cool red stuff on them, right? I love red. It's one of my favorite colors. So I primed them black, and then I just basically gave them a nice red zenithal with 2 tones of red airbrush paint. At this point, I then asked folks online if I should keep the bodies red or the capes red. I generally decided that the capes looked better with the airbrush zenithal. It really helped to bring out the folds and all that kind of stuff. But honestly, I could have gone either way. Now, since I wanted to keep the capes red, then I just went back and painted the bodies black. So this piece of problem solving is this. How do you airbrush the cape without airbrushing the entirety of the body? As I just showed you, that's the neat part. You don't. Rather than just trying to mask off some of the model, you instead airbrush the whole thing, and then, with a regular old paintbrush, just paint over the parts that you don't want to be airbrushed afterwards, right? I usually use a dark speed paint for something like that. My favorites are usually Grim Black or Dark Wood from the Army Painter. And then once that dries, then you can paint the rest of the model that you've just painted black, almost like taking it back to primer, right? And then make it look however you want. In this situation, I used silver dry brush, and I think they turned out really fun and they're cool. And this does actually work really well for dry brushing as well, instead of like airbrushing. Instead of saying, how do I only dry brush part of the model but not all of the model? Again, you don't. Now I'm working on some more Robot Legions. I'm maybe even working on a whole Grimdark Future army. Not a big one, like 1,000 points or something like that. We'll kind of see how it goes. I decided to work outside my comfort area a little bit and went with a more kind of teal sort of look, right? I textured their capes a little before priming, then I primed them black. And then I did, again, some airbrush zenithal. I posted some kind of work in progress photos, and someone asked, well, how are you going to paint the other parts of the model? Like everything's all one color. How are you going to go in and now airbrush just the body and not get it on the cape? And I explained the other parts will get done with a regular brush. Problem solving by using an airbrush and then using regular brushes. It makes a lot of sense. Another thing to really consider when trying to problem solve your miniatures, should you paint your miniature completely put together? Or should you leave some parts off to make it easier to paint? I also made a video about this nearly 9 years ago, pachow, And my ideas about sub-assemblies, they haven't changed very much. If it's a big shield that the model is holding that will block my brush's access to a large portion of the model, then we'll leave the shield off and paint it separately. It's sometimes a little harder to glue, the shield part on later. Depends on how the model was built and everything like that, but usually it's less of a hassle than the alternative. I bought this model used at a convention. It was already built, but unpainted, unprimed, all that kind of stuff. And the person who built it left the shield on, built it with the shield. They also didn't really scrape any of the mold lines off, if I'm honest, but that's neither here nor there. I took care of the mold lines, but I left the shield where it was. Then I gave it a good zenithal coat of some reds with my airbrush. I told you I like red. And that's as far as I've gotten because that shield is really in the way. And if I had just tried to somehow remove it before priming and spraying him red, then he'd seem probably less daunting to paint and he'd probably be done already. Problems will stop your hobby motivation sometimes, actually most times. So if you have an idea of how to fix the problem, even if you've not tried it before, like me and Uncle Tickles and the poster putty, then that can really help keep you moving. Otherwise, the most important thing to remember in solving miniature painting problems is this: everything is solvable. Even if you have to repaint some parts, or reprime some stuff, or remove something to paint it separately, or even if you have to strip the model completely and start all over again, all problems in your miniatures can be solved. Experiences can help you solve problems in the future, but the internet can teach you the solutions now as well. Do you have a solution for solving problems, miniature problems that you'd like to share with the class? Like the poster putty thing or the sub-assemblies trick or whatever, that kind of stuff, right? Let us all know what kind of problem solver you are down in the comments below. And while you're down there, please fix the depressmentation of the like button problem. I'd appreciate it, and it helps the channel. You can also hit subscribe for more videos like this one every single week. It's free. Thanks for watching.